Well, that demonstrated the breadth of our support as an organisation, and to demonstrate still further the breadth of support that we've got, Alec Neil.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Ian. The last time I think I shared the platform with Ian when we were both on the same side was the way back when we were students, and I was the chair of the National and the Scottish Organisation of Labour Students, and Ian was one of the rebels, but he was a lot older than me, of course, at the time. Can I say...
Some people might believe that.
Can I look at this in three dimensions? I think there's three dimensions to this debate. There's a European dimension, there's the British-UK dimension, and there is the Scottish dimension. Now, I voted for leave, and I made it absolutely clear I voted for leave. And let me say, I take strong exception to those people on the Remain side, from wherever they are, of classifying those people who voted for leave along with the Boris Johnsons of this world. I voted for leave for progressive reasons, not the same reasons as the Boris Johnsons and the Michael Goves. And those reasons were quite across a broad spectrum. When the SNP adopted its policy of independence in Europe in 1989, Europe was a very different kettle of fish from what it is today, in particular in two main respects. First of all, under the leadership of people like Jacques Delors, the French socialist, it was a much more progressive organisation than it's turned out to be since he departed the scene. And if you compare that with all the advances that were made, and Gordon's absolutely right, we made a lot of advances in workers' rights long before we ever joined the European Union, or the common market as it then was. There were advances under their umbrella, but they're not entirely responsible for that. But I found that the contradiction, comparing the situation, say, 89 with the situation today, is a very different kind of EU. I don't see how people in one breath can talk about the workers' rights given to us by the EU and at the same time defend the way in which people like the people in Greece and in Portugal, who have been impoverished by the EU and quite frankly forced into massive unemployment as a direct result of the EU's refusal to help them in their hour of need. But it's not just in relation to the likes of Greece and Portugal. For example, we now have a very right-wing government in Poland, which has been trying to suspend the independence of the judiciary in Poland, which is contradictory to every charter signed in terms of the United Nations, in terms of EU treaties, in terms of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And yet the EU has done absolutely nothing about it. And more recently, the Catalonian situation. Now, this is not about whether you're in favour or not of independence for the Catalonian people. My view is a simple one. It's up to the Catalonian people to decide whether they should be independent. But there's very clearly in all the charters that these countries have all signed, every one of the 28 members of the European Union, there are rights to civil liberty, which were denied the people of Catalonia when they voted in the Catalonian referendum a couple of months ago. And in fact, the Vice President of the European Union actually came out and defended the brutality of the Spanish authorities against the Catalonian people who voted in that referendum. And they've also signed up to the principle of self-determination. And I, for the life of me, do not understand, even from their own selfish political point of view, why the Spanish government hasn't basically repeated what was done in Scotland, whereby you facilitate a referendum. If the result of that referendum is independence for Catalonia, then it was going to happen eventually anyway. There has to be a democratic route to self-determination, otherwise you end up with a repeat of the kind of Basque situation we've had in the past that nobody wants. And if it's a no vote in the referendum, then it's status quo, and I'm sure the Catalonian people would accept the decision that the majority had made. But not only did the EU not defend the right to self-determination, not only did they not defend the right to civil liberties in terms of how they were treated, the people in Catalonia were treated by the Spanish government, they actually took the side of the Spanish government, which flies in the face of every fundamental democratic principle that we have ever fought for and believed in. And there are other reasons. Some of them have already been mentioned. I've served in 4 ministerial posts in the Scottish Government. And in every single one, there were examples of where the EU rules were actually holding us back, either in terms of developing the economy or extending the rights of people within our society. And let me just give you one of them. One of the things we wanted to do, and it wasn't hiding behind the EU rules, Gordon, it was just the law as it stood and stands at the present time. We wanted to build in to the Procurement Reform Act a provision that no company in Scotland could be considered for a public contract unless they paid their workers at least the real living wage. I'm not talking about the Tory living wage, I'm talking about the real living wage. Now, if we had been able to introduce that in Scotland, then by now the vast bulk of the workers, if not nearly every worker, because there are very few companies that don't bid for public sector work at some point or other, would have had the real living wage. But EU rules precluded us from doing that. We're not the member state, so we were powerless to challenge that in any way whatsoever. And in fact, you've seen what happens with the minimum unit pricing legislation that was democratically passed and endorsed by the Scottish Parliament 5 years ago. It's taken us 5 years through the courts to get the ability to implement our own democratic decision on minimum unit pricing because of European rules. And I don't think that's right in principle, and it's certainly not right in practice. And these are 2 examples, and I could give you many more. Gordon's mentioned others like the ferries, and others have been mentioned as well. Many examples of where there are real restrictions. Keith Brown and I looked at what we could do to promote public ownership of the railways when I was the Infrastructure Secretary and Keith was the Minister of Transport. And again, EU legislation was a major drawback for us. So we shouldn't be under any illusion that we are hampered in terms of implementing a progressive agenda in our own country by many of the EU rules. Now, in days gone by, in 1989, when we agreed to independence in Europe, small countries had the right of veto against those measures that were against their interest. Very few matters at that time were decided by qualified majority voting. And of course, the EU itself at that time had far fewer members than the 28 members it has at the present time. So if something was going through that you fundamentally disagreed with, no matter whether you were the size of Luxembourg or Germany, you had the right to veto it. And of course, believing in independence, if we had become independent, in those days, we would have had the right of veto to protect our own vital national interests. And Gordon's right, that's no longer the case. Small countries are now ridden over roughshod by the big boys in the European Union. It is no longer the progressive democratic body that it used to be. And other reasons. If you look at the speeches made over the summer this year by the new president of France, the Tony Blair of France, Macron, and the big speech made by that idiot of a man, Jean-Claude Juncker, the agenda is very clear. The agenda is to create a federal Europe, similar to the United States of America. Now, I understand that in countries like Germany and France and Italy and Belgium and Luxembourg, there's maybe a big appetite for federalism. I understand that those core members of the euro probably think to make the euro work, because it's not going to work unless there is some political unity amongst the euro countries, then to make it work, they might have to go down that road. The problem is that the way Europe is going, we could be forced down that road against our own wishes. And I think a federal Europe could be a disaster, particularly, not exclusively because of, but particularly because of the march of the right. We've seen the elections in Germany where the extreme right get 13% of the vote and 90-odd MPs in the Bundestag. We've seen the march of the right in Italy, in France, and in the smaller countries that used to be the progressive wing of the European Union. The march of the right in Holland, and even in the Scandinavian countries, the right have been on the march in recent times. Can you imagine if we end up with a majority of governments in Europe making these decisions over which have no veto, and they are represented or forced to take account of the views of these extreme right-wing people who are getting representation within their own countries. Austria being another classic example. Under Kreisky, I always remember Tony Benn, when I was in the Labour Party, telling me about Kreisky and how progressive he was in Austria. And we've gone from one extreme, where it's Kreisky, a great socialist leader in Austria, leading that country as the Chancellor of Austria, down now to the kind of right-wing people who are running it today. So Europe is changing, and it's not for the better, and I don't believe operates in our interests. And can I also say that the tone of what's come out of the European bureaucrats, not so much, to be fair, the political leaders of the individual countries, but from the Jean-Claude Junckers, and the contempt in their voice for us, angers me enormously. Because as Ian quite rightly said, we have approached this. I think, to be fair, Theresa May has and I'm not often fair to Theresa May, but I think, to be fair, that she has tried to present this as friends renegotiating their relationship on a friendly basis. But that brings me to the British dimension of all of this. Because I don't think, and I talked to a lot of Tories, both MPs and MSPs and just ordinary Tory researchers and all the rest of it. And even the Tories privately in Scotland are saying they have never seen such an incompetent government of any shade, of any party, of any colour ever in the UK. They could not bargain their way out of a paper bag. Now, when I was in the Labour movement, the giants of the trade union movement, not just in Scotland, by the way, the giants of the trade union movement were from Scotland, but they were British trade unionists. Alec Kitson, some of you will remember, a great man. John Pollock, the only trade unionist to take on Thatcher and actually beat her. He beat Thatcher in a way that no other trade union at that time did. And that shows you the skill, the negotiating skill of these great trade unionists. And you compare the negotiating ability of a Kitson or a Pollock to the negotiating ability of a David Davis, Theresa May, Boris Johnson and Liam Fox, and it's day and night. It's Premier Division versus Third Division in the Junior League. It's pathetic. At every opportunity, they've allowed themselves to be in the back foot. And as Ian said, what we've got to watch is that we are no tarred with their brush, because that's not, they don't represent our view of leave tactically any more than they do in terms of the reasons why we voted for leave. But the tragedy is that we've got such an incompetent crew through the cabinet in London that they're getting leave a bad name, even amongst people who voted for leave. Now, it hasn't changed my mind. I think if there was another referendum tomorrow, and fortunately I don't think there will be, despite the Tony Blairs of this world trying to get a second referendum, but if there was a second referendum tomorrow, I would still vote leave. But I would try and get a different team to negotiate the deal, because this lot are pathetic. But the other thing in terms of the British dimension is this, and that is that they've got to seize the initiative. I think before they submitted the Article 50 letter they should have seized the high ground and given a categorical commitment that all those people in the EU living in the United Kingdom at the present time would get their full rights absolutely guaranteed, irrespective of the outcome of the negotiations. And that would have put them on a far better position, not a defensive position, but an offensive in the literal sense of that word position. And it would have sent a very clear message to the people of Europe, over the heads of the leaders of Europe, that we're not leaving Europe, we're leaving the European Union. We recognise the importance of people coming from Europe and British people going to work in the European Union before and after Brexit. In today's global economy, of course, we're going to have people travelling, living, working, emigrating between different countries. The one caveat is to make sure that that's not abused to drive down the living standards of any group of workers in any of the countries affected, be they in Europe or in the UK. And if they had done that, I think that would have set a tone. It would have been very difficult for the Jean-Claude Junckers to exploit the way they've exploited the ineptitude of Theresa May and her team. And there are many other tactical advantages they could and should have taken long before now. And I hope that they've learned their lesson, and actually for the remainder of the negotiating period, they actually get themselves on the front foot instead of constantly on the back foot. And then there's the Scottish dimension. And let me say right away, I have always believed, and I'm on record long before the Brexit referendum, saying this in a political cabinet in the SNP in 2014. I never ever believed that we should tie together the issue of Scottish independence and Brexit in terms of a second referendum and so on. My view is, if you look at the history of the success or otherwise of the SNP and the support for independence, and I know a lot of people in here don't support independence. I'm not preaching independence, I'm just making this point. That support for independence actually goes up when the Scots feel confident, feel prosperous. It goes down when they feel as though they're under threat. So I never believed if you get a different result north and south of the border that you would end up with an increased support for independence. And I don't believe if you end up with what's perceived to be a bad deal or no deal, if that's where we end up. I think most Scots are more likely to run for the British umbrella than to run towards independence. Now, I regret that, but I think that's the realpolitik of the political situation in Scotland. So it's not in our interest to get a bad deal. It's not in our interest to get a no deal. It's in our interest to get a good, acceptable deal that addresses the concerns that people have, even amongst in Scotland people who voted Remain. I know a lot of people who voted Remain, quote, with gritted teeth, end quote. And they want to see a deal that allows us to run our own economy much more effectively than the present arrangements do. And just on that, let me say this, there's been some studies and propaganda put about, you know, by now we should have been in deep depression if you listen to the Remain side, and yet we've seen people at different times are telling us the Scottish economy has never been stronger, unemployment's at a 40-year low, employment's at a 40-year high, and so on and so forth. The two can't be right. And there's been a lot of nonsense in terms of the economic forecast published by various bodies. When you actually look at the truth of the matter is that Brexit, the economic consequences of Brexit will entirely depend on the deal that's struck for the successor trade agreement and things of that nature. And to date, I don't think you can see a net loss or a net gain just because we're in these negotiations. There's a lot of black propaganda out there that we should fight against. I just want to give you one example of one of the things that's never mentioned by the Remain people. I put in a request to the Scottish Parliament's Information Centre a few months ago. And I asked them the question, if Scotland were to get our proportionate share of the money that goes to Europe at the present time from the UK government on an annual basis, how much would it be? So our share of the annual contribution, net of the rebates, about £1.6 billion a year. I then asked, supposing that money was used to fund every single EU programme in Scotland, for agriculture, for fishing, for Erasmus, for R&D, and everything the EU currently funds, how much would that cost? Of the order of £800 million a year. That means we would have had, and I've had this confirmed by Spice, we would have had £800 million a year extra in the Scottish Exchequer to spend on health, education, housing, and all the other things. And yet, when you look at all these brilliant people doing their economic forecasts, they don't mention that £800 million of additional money that would be coming into the Scottish economy, and supposing that was invested in housing. You have a multiplier effect then. You create thousands of jobs in construction. If you invest in life sciences, which has got the same multiplier as the construction sector, it would lead to many more high-quality jobs and investment in Scotland. The economic impact of that is totally ignored by all these brilliant people we're supposed to believe. So the reality is that when you look at the economy and the economic impact of it, the fact of life is that the benefits to Scotland could be considerable, provided we make sure we get our share of the spoils once we stop contributing after the transition period to the EU budget as we are today. So whether you look at this at a European dimension, where Europe is changing not for the better, and it certainly was a driving force for me in voting for leave. If you look at the British dimension, where unfortunately we've got a shower of idiots handling the negotiations, and we need to try and do something and input to that as much as we possibly can. If you look at the Scottish dimension, I think it's high time the people on the leave side were actually fighting back against some of the nonsense that we're getting fed day and daily. We've got to try to marshal opinion on the leave side in the months ahead as we head, hopefully, towards an agreement. But we should do it not from the point of view of trying to be reckless, but from the point of view of trying to get three things fundamentally for Scotland. Number one, the powers coming back from Brussels in relation to Scotland, all of them, including over workers' rights, environmental rights, and all the rest of it, and the budget share, should all come back to the Scottish Parliament. I think we could unite on that, irrespective of your views on independence. Secondly, the money that goes with those powers. And thirdly, a successor trade deal that gets rid of the problems we've currently got with single market rules and all the rest of it, but a trade deal that's good for Scottish industry, Scottish trade, Scottish employment, Scottish workers' rights, the Scottish environment. That's what we should be aiming for. And if we can achieve that, we'll have done service to the Scottish people. Thank you.